Good afternoon, council and staff. May I have a mover and seconder to call the meeting to order, please? I have councillors Fisher and Deputy Cabral that the special meeting of the Council of the Township of November 18th, 2024 come to order at 2 p.m. All those in favor? And that is carried. Councillor, any disclosures of pecuniary interest? And not seeing any. At this time, I will call on CO Schmidt to provide an overview for today's budget session.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Actually, I'll defer to Director Bedard, and I will be speaking once Director Bedard has gone through the first couple of items on the agenda.
Thank you. Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. If I could ask the clerk to pull up my presentation. Great. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Council. If we could move to the next slide, please, just an overview of the agenda of what we're going to talk about today. This afternoon, we'll focus on two budget foundational topics in more detail. These two topics being supplemental taxation revenue and the impact of reassessment. Next, we'll walk through a recap of the 2025 proposed consolidated budget. And lastly, I'll end today's presentation addressing the November 6th council direction. Each section on the agenda has been prepared on its own, and I would request that at the end of each section, council may ask questions relating to that section, and we can wrap that one and move on to the next. Next slide, please. Move on to the next one as well. First up on today's agenda is supplemental taxation revenue. We'll start today's presentation with a definition and a bit of an explanation with respect to supplementary tax revenue. So supplementary tax revenue reflects change to property classification or assessed value due to a change in use or improvements made to property. Essentially, the value of the property has changed, and therefore the property taxes that property pays must change as well in relation to the change in use. When an event occurs that triggers a change, MPAC will issue a notice to the property owner of the impact to their property's assessment. When the value of the property increases by more than 5% or by at least $10,000, the change is backdated to be effective as of the date the change occurred. For changes below this threshold, minor changes, the property's value is updated January 1st of the next year. When we look at the concept of supplemental taxation revenue, it's comprised of both supplemental assessment and omitted assessment, each with their own definitions under the Assessment Act. Supplemental assessment applies to the current taxation year only, and it is issued when a change in property use event occurs. An example of this is when a property is no longer eligible for inclusion in the farm property class. Another example of this is when a property changes classification from residential to commercial, reflective of a home-based business. Moving to omitted assessment can apply to the current and preceding two taxation years, and this is issued when land that should have been assessed is omitted from the tax roll. An example of omitted assessment is a new residential dwelling. In some instances, it does take over a year for the property to become assessed. Given this timeline, legislation allows for omitted assessment to be backdated up to the two preceding years to ensure fairness and equity in the tax system, and that all taxpayers are paying their fair share of the tax burden. Next slide, please. All right, now that we've had a brief explanation of supplemental tax revenue, we'll move into how this revenue source impacts the township and the township's budget. Supplemental taxation revenue is primarily generated through building permit activity. This isn't the only way it's generated, but it's the primary source. This building permit activity is monitored by both the township and the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, otherwise known as MPAC. When we look at permit activity, we're really focusing on changes to the property that would change the value of the property and therefore impact the amount of property taxes that property would pay. For example, these changes include new residential construction, renovation, additions, new outbuildings, and again, really anything that would impact the property or improve its market value. When we look at these new additions, new constructions, renovations, the trigger is occupancy. And once occupancy is granted, again, this is the trigger for the improvement to become assessed. When this occurs, MPAC will conduct a site visit to establish the appropriate valuation reflective of the changes made to property. So they'll look at the addition or the new construction and determine the market value that that change has. Once the valuation is determined, notice of such is sent to both the property owner and to the municipality. A supplementary and/or omitted tax bill is then issued, effective, again, the date of occupancy or the change event, and this would include taxes payable for the current year and a maximum of 2 preceding years if applicable. Looking at how supplemental taxation revenue impacts the township's budget is truly a reflection of past building permit activity and, to a lesser extent, expected future activity. Each year, the township knows to expect supplemental taxation revenue because of building permits that have been issued in the current and preceding years. Existing building permits provide the township with an indication that supplemental revenue will be received in the future. Expected future building permit activity provides the township with a guideline to measure with respect to how conservatively to budget supplemental taxation revenue in the future. Should growth forecast positively, this may be an indication that the township could increase the amount of supplemental revenue expected in the future, and vice versa. However, to avoid significant fluctuations in this revenue source, a conservative approach should be taken, given that if a surplus should exist for supplemental tax revenue, this surplus could be reallocated to a reserve at year-end to help offset cost pressures the township faces due to growth. Next slide, please. The chart on this slide shows the supplemental taxation revenue history from 2020 through 2024. The blue line on top is the township's actual revenue compared to the green line, which is the budget. The graph demonstrates that from 2020 to 2024, the township's supplemental taxation revenue exceeded budget in each of these years. Supplemental revenue for 2025 has been budgeted at the same level as 2024, and this amount is approximately $250,000. As mentioned, should supplemental revenue continue to exceed budget, this can be considered part of the surplus allocation and, with council's approval, reallocated as necessary or desirable to offset future growth-related costs. This concludes my notes on supplemental taxation revenue.
Thank you. Councilor, are there any questions for Director Bedard on this? Deputy Cabral?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Just on that note, and I know that for me, I've always had a bit of a hard time with this one because it kind of leads people to believe that we're not starting at zero is what I'm getting at. And I'm also curious when it comes to this, whether or not if we didn't do that, would we not be in a better position had we not used supplemental income last year going into this year? Those same dollars would have been available to offset the cost. So that's the part that, and you know, yes, we have a surplus, which is always nice, but it's not a guaranteed surplus. But if the surplus was there and we weren't dipping into it in the future, then the entire surplus would be available for the 2026 budget to offset going into 2026. So I still have trouble rationalizing why we do it. I can understand why we're doing it in order to reduce the impact of the taxation on the budget by using these dollars that are going to come to us in the future. But at the same time, I also have to ask myself, if we did not do that, what would the position have been going into this year's budget if we hadn't used supplementary income in the 2024 budget when we went into it? So because my understanding is there are some municipalities that do a base zero budget. So are we different from them, or can you elaborate on whether or not it might be more prudent for us not to use those dollars and save them for the next year? That way, when we have a surplus, we know that we can use those dollars.
Director Bedard?
I think Mayor Coughlin, through you to Deputy Cabral. In my experience with a number of municipalities in my career, we have always budgeted for supplemental revenue. because it is a known revenue source that we expect to receive, budgeting for this source of revenue helps decrease the amount of taxes we need to generate in a given taxation year. If we did not expect to receive this revenue in that instance, we would probably not budget for it. But given that we know we will expect supplementary taxation revenue, and to be respectful of the taxpayer, we factor that into the budget.
Follow on, Deputy Cabral?
Thank you. And I guess on that part too, I guess it's the terminology that sometimes is being used, because at the end of the day, they are tax dollars that are coming back to offset the budget. And if we take those tax dollars out, and I've asked this to be done in the past, to give us a kind of a baseline where we're actually starting from, what the percentage would be without those supplementary dollars. And I think it's $180,000 per 1% increase is the rough number that we're looking at. So without the supplementary dollars, we'd be looking at about what, a 1.65% increase above the 14 and change we're already looking at for the base budget.
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Deputy Cabral. If we were to remove supplemental taxation revenue from the budget today, the tax impact would be approximately 1.31% higher than what we proposed.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Moore?
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Coughlin, just a quick question, Director Bedard. If I'm following this correctly, then we have permits that have been pulled but didn't get completed in 2024. Is that why it fell off so drastically? So we've collected on those, but they're still sitting unfinished.
Director
you.
Bedard?
Too anxious on the mic here. Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Councillor Moore. The reduction in budget in 2024 is a reflection of the building permit activity expected in the current environment. So we saw that increase in permit activity coming out of COVID. And we've certainly seen that reduction that we're experiencing right now. So the reduction was just more in line to what we anticipate, given there are building permits out there that have been pulled. However, the frequency of new construction being completed and occupied isn't at the same level in 2024 and 2025 that we would have experienced in just a few years ago.
Follow on?
Thank you. And what is the exact figure then? I don't want to guess, because it could be that we've collected, if I'm reading this correctly, say $400,000. Is that what that total would be roughly?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Moore, when we look at 2024 and this amount isn't finalized yet, as there's still some supplemental taxation runs we have to process, we conduct these right through to the end of the year. The actuals are slightly over 600,000 compared to our budget of 250.
Thank you.
Councillor Thompson and then Councillor Fisher.
Through the chair to Director Bedard. So it appears to me from this graph that we've become quite a bit more conservative with regards to the budget compared to the actual revenue. Can you explain why that we're doing that?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Councillor Thompson. There's different budget approaches to take with respect to supplementary revenue. The approach that I am taking is we want to be conservative with this revenue source, and it speaks to a budget approach that I've shared with senior leadership. Is we want to be predictable and we want to be stable. That we typically associate a tax increase with an increase in spending. A tax increase is also a result of a decrease in revenue as well. So when we look at the budget change from 2023 to 2024, that budget change where we reduced revenue represented a tax increase. So the budget change, or the philosophy we're taking now, is to look at more of a historical average approach and use that baseline instead of having big fluctuations, which may lead to a tax reduction in one year and then in the next year, subsequent tax increase. It's just about finding that stable point that's predictable and not being reactionary. And also given that should we experience a surplus, we have growth related costs that this surplus could offset.
Counselor Fisher?
Yeah, actually, a lot of my questions have been answered up to this point, but I will say thank you for the explanation because I know it's a bit baffling for some people, supplementary revenue. But I was going to say, and you just covered it, I think it's good to be conservative because in my eyes, we're sort of counting revenues before we've collected them, right? So it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's like signing a contract for work you haven't done yet. You can count it to some extent, but I would say if you're pushing the limits of it and it turns on you, right? So I would say if we're going to engage in this type of thing, which it sounds like is common practice, it sounds like it, I would definitely say being conservative is the way to be, right? Just in case, if those things don't come to fruition, it could turn on you. But everything else was answered, so thank you.
Counselor Alexander?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Director Bedard. So if we're looking at a 350,000 differential from what we budgeted for last year to what we actually brought in, which I believe is what we've said, where does that 350,000 go? Does that go to offset the taxes for next year, or does it go into a general operational pool just so we can understand?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Alexander. The surplus in this in 2024 would be brought to council as part of closing off 2024, so it would form part of the township's general overall surplus. Staff would report to council as of our year-end position, and then that surplus could be reallocated at the discretion of council, whether it be to an infrastructure reserve or another purpose to offset growth. That would be a decision of council to make as part of formally closing 2024.
Counselor Alexander?
Okay, so I understand that. Thank you. What I'm struggling with is that because we are reaching into the future, and I understand why, but if you were to take a reset year, and this certainly is not the year to do that, so we won't even entertain that, but if you were, you would just be moving forward in a fashion in which you were spending the money that you had collected versus reaching in if you took a reset year. Again, not suggesting that, but to me, because we are reaching into the future, we budgeted, we collected more, can we not take that 350,000 and put it against the tax rate this year in order to bring it down? Because essentially that amount would have helped us establish the tax rate the year previous. Am I talking in circles? Am I making sense?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Councillor Alexander. It's in concept, something similar could be done. If we anticipate that, we're going to exceed budget of supplementary revenue, it would be placed into reserve in 2024, a year end, and then it could be drawn from that reserve again in 2025. It would be an accounting transaction. That said, from my point of view, it wouldn't be recommended to use this revenue in a future year. We would really just be in my view, potentially artificially reducing taxes in 2025 if we were to draw from a previous year and draw from reserves.
Deputy Cabral?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. And on that point, I think last year when that came up, council actually put some into the infrastructure deficit. I don't know what the exact dollar figure was, so some of it went there, and I think some went into one of the reserves. And when you look at that number, though, because I think it was pretty close to $1 million. I'm not going to say it was $1 million. I'm going to say it was pretty close to $1 million. But when you take that $1 million that was surplus, and you had projected that in advance, literally, we could have had zero increase, maybe even a tax reduction based on the amount of tax dollars that actually came in that year. But we're looking at this here now, and the building is not there. The houses are not selling the way they used to sell. And, I think we have to be a lot more careful going forward. But if that's what happens, going forward, then I think you can either, our infrastructure deficit was huge, so that's why we're putting, I believe, CAO Schmidt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, 1.5% specifically to infrastructure the last number of years, or 1%. And that was because we were really behind it. So we put some extra money in there last year. I mean, we could have utilized that money to offset this year's taxes. But I don't think that makes appropriate sense to do that. I think when you have that surplus based on, your development, your new builds, and the changes, as you're saying, to assessment throughout the whole year, the way I see it is a bonus at the end of the year, a bonus that you can utilize to provide better service, to better facilities, do whatever you want with it for the residents of Springwater Township. Not necessarily it's everybody's best interest to reduce the tax burden by utilizing those funds. So I just wanted to let council know that we actually have done that. And I think last year was specifically to the infrastructure. I don't know the exact figure, CO Schmidt. I'm thinking $700,000 or so went to infrastructure. Thank you.
CO Schmidt?
Thank you, Mayor Colgan, through you to Deputy Mayor Cabral and members of council. So I don't recall the exact number either, Deputy Mayor, off the top of my hand, but yes, the surplus was definitely in the $1 million range. So, this council has not seen our final 2023 financials, so you may not be, top of mind right now, if you will. But, further to Director Bedard's comments and some of the comments around council table here tonight, what we're trying to do is trying to smooth this as best we can. So you don't see the big ebbs and flows that you're seeing from 2022 to 2023 and 2024. The idea is to come up with a conservative number for these revenues, knowing full well that we're going to get them. And so again, you're not seeing these big ebbs and flows. And then at the end of the year, when we bring forward the township's surplus deficit position, our actuals, that's when you'll start to see the impacts of some of these supplementaries. So you would see that right now, 350 would be part of that potential surplus that you would see for 2024. At that time, council has the opportunity to allocate to a reserve or pay down debt or whatever you choose to do at that time. So to Director Bedard's point, there are a couple of different methodologies. You could go the opposite route and you could try to budget exactly what you think the supplementaries are going to be, but now you're going to have these ebbs and flows every year, which we're trying to avoid. We could do that, but understand that there's those implications, right? And just based on my experience as well, typically this is the way that I budgeted throughout my career in municipalities that I've worked for. Again, it's more of a policy decision, if you will, from council as if you wish to change that. I know in speaking to some of my colleagues, they've talked about, with their surplus at the end of the year, that a certain percentage goes to capital assets, a certain percentage goes to pay down debt, and a certain percentage goes towards growth-related type expenditures. So we can look at bringing forward some possible policies, examples for your consideration. But this is kind of the methodology that we've used for this year and possibly moving forward, unless council provides direction otherwise.
Councillor Fisher?
First, a comment. I actually like what you just said about having sort of predetermined areas for surpluses to go into. But the other question I have, looking into the future with larger projects like the DCs coming from the development on Gill Road, I'm thinking in those years we'd be projecting higher, understandably, for our revenues, but a lot of projects that are DC supported, Craig Road, the hub, those DCs that would be coming in and reflected would already be spent. So how would you account for that? Like I guess the surplus would be spent, in other words. So can you sort of see how that would work?
CO Schmidt?
Thank you, Mayor Colgan, through you to Councillor Fisher. I'll start and maybe Director Bedard can follow up here. So just to be clear, Councillor Fisher, on the development charges are a one-time fee that we collect on building permit issuance. So as soon as building permits are issued, actually, let me back up. there's different components of the DC. So what the council or what the township has modified over the years was the timing of when we collect development charges. So we used to collect all development charges upon building permit issuance. In our 2018, I want to say, we came forward with some changes based on long-range financial plan, whereby we actually can collect the hard surface components of the DC, so road, water, wastewater, bridges. Those DCs can be collected upon registration of the subdivision. So we can collect them in advance. And then essentially what we call internally here, the soft service components, parks and some of those other services, those DCs are collected upon building permit issuance. So when a little bit later, if you will. But again, there are one-time fees that we get. And to your point, they are projected for certain projects within the background study. Obviously, there's some flexibility there, but they are growth-related projects, and those funds can only be spent on growth-related projects. Development charges, that is.
So then in the future, would we see them on this particular graph, or because they're one time, would they? No? Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Deputy Cabral?
Yeah, just maybe to clarify that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when we're talking about supplemental taxation, we are talking specifically about property taxes, not DCs. So those are dollars that are going to come in on a regular basis into the next year when the new budget comes through. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think too, when we do have the supplemental at the end of the year, I recall one year we had a culvert burst, which was a large impact to us, and we were able to utilize some of the surplus in order to offset that. So it's typically one time, not ongoing operational expenses with that as well. So having some flexibility when it is brought to council to address instances within the year, I think is important as well. Council, if there's nothing further on the supplemental taxes, we can move on to the assessment. On to the next one. Director Bedard.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Up next is the impact of reassessment and how that will impact taxes payable and the township's budget. We're actually going to watch this 2-minute video by MPAC. I think they can say it much more eloquently than I can.
Property taxes are based on your home's value. What you might not know is that an increase in your home's value doesn't necessarily mean your taxes will go up. To explain, let's take a look at how your property taxes are calculated. Imagine there's a town that only has 3 homes, and they're each worth a different amount. The total cost to provide all of the town's services is $1,200. This is collected through property taxes. Each homeowner pays property taxes based on their home's assessed value. So we take the total cost of services and divide it by the total property value. This tax rate is applied to all the houses to get enough money to pay for the town's services. Each homeowner pays according to the assessed value of their home, and every 4 years, the houses are reassessed. Let's say all 3 properties have gone up equally in value. The total cost of services hasn't changed, but the total property value has increased. When this happens, there will be a decrease in the tax rate. Now, when we apply that new rate on all the homes, everyone still pays the same. Now, let's say another 4 years has gone by, and these homes are reassessed. During this time, the house on the right gains more market value than the other 2. The total value of all the homes have increased, which means the town has to calculate a new tax rate. With this new tax rate, the first 2 homes will actually pay less than the home on the right that was reassessed at a higher value. Since the cost of services hasn't changed, the town doesn't need to collect more property taxes on the whole. However, since property taxes are based on a home's value, taxes for each individual home could potentially go up or down based on the rest of the homes. So, what happens when the cost to provide services goes up? Well, it means more property taxes need to be collected from every home, and a new tax rate is calculated. To get the new rate, we take that amount that the town now needs and divide it by all of the property values. The new rate is applied to all the homes, and now everyone has to pay the new tax amount to continue to fund the town's services. So, let's review. 1. Property taxes are based on the assessed value of a home. If all assessments go up equally, everyone pays the same. 2. If all assessments do not go up equally, there's a redistribution of the tax. 3. If the town's cost to provide services increases, the municipality may choose to increase the tax rate. When this happens, everyone pays their share of that increase. And that explains the relationship between property value and property taxes.
Councilor, are there any questions for Director Bedard on the video? Deputy Cabral?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. So what I take from that video is literally every property in Springwater Township is put into a giant pool and then divided to find out what the tax rate is going to be. And then that tax rate is applied to the assessed value of each home. Okay. So based on that, is there also a differential between specific areas of Springwater Township as well? Like say up in Elmvale versus down in say Midhurst, where property values are substantially higher versus property taxes that are not quite as high because the assessment is lower in Elmvale, or does it all balance out in the wash at the end?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Deputy Cabral. The same tax rate for all residential properties is applied. The tax rate doesn't change whether dependent on the level of service or location. Rather, the assessment would reflect the services or the location or the property specific features of that individual property. So again, the tax rate's the same. If you're a residential taxpayer, every taxpayer pays the exact same tax rate, but every taxpayer will pay a different amount of taxes based on the individual features that comprise their property's assessment. So if you're a property in Midhurst or Minising, would pay a different amount compared to Elmvale, and that could be just a feature of the services and general location.
Follow on?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. And I guess just on that point there, does the I'm going to call them amenities, for lack of a better term, someone who lives say in Aptu, and maybe no street lights, that kind of a thing, versus amenities that would be found in Elmvale, fire hydrants, street lights, those types of things. Is there a difference in the tax rate that is payable, or is that just part and parcel to the services that Springwater Township provides, given on where you might be located?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Deputy Cabral. Those property specific features that you mentioned would have no bearing on the tax rate itself. But again, those property specific features would play a role or may play a role to varying extents in that property's assessment. So if you have those services, you may expect to pay more because your property may have a higher market value than properties that may not have streetlights or may not have a sidewalk or some sort of fire suppression that you mentioned.
I have Councilors Alexander and Thompson.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, to Director Bedard. Do you know roughly when the last time the majority of the houses in Springwater were assessed through MPAC and when we are expecting that to happen?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Alexander. The last provincial reassessment happened in 2017 with property values. The valuation date was January 1st, 2016. So it has been a number of years since reassessment has occurred. It was scheduled 4 years ago now, postponed as part of the pandemic. And it, with respect to when reassessment will occur, we do not know.
For that. And if we were to follow the previous cycle of 2016, it was supposed to happen in 2020. We were anticipating it in 2024, but haven't heard whether or not they're going to move forward with that. And sorry, was there a follow-on? So I have Councillor Thompson and then Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. There seems to be a lot of anxiety about this with the public, and I think some of it's come from us. I think there's been some false information shared because of lack of understanding. And just so that I could be clear, I called MPAC this week, and they were really helpful the only people that so let's say I do an improvement on my house and I pull a permit. I was surprised to know that they immediately know when the permit was pulled and they know when it's closed so that they can reassess the value of my property. But if I don't pull a permit and do a significant improvement on my home, they won't know the improvements. And when the reassessment takes place, they will actually come and physically look at my house and reassess me. So the way that she explained it to me, the only people that really should have any anxiety or worry about this process are the ones that did major improvements on their home and didn't pull permits. Hopefully we have none of those in Springwater, but they're anticipating there probably will be a few. So hopefully this really alleviates the anxiety with our residents that there's not, if somebody's taxes have gone up, it means that somebody's have gone down. It's our responsibility to set the tax levies and to set the tax rate. Impact doesn't do that. They have a formula that allows us how to distribute them. So I don't think it's going to be a major impact in our community and really don't feel it's a major worry for us.
Councillor Moore?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. When I was at the Autumn Fest at Midhurst this fall, MPAC had a booth set up there. And the woman that represents our area, and I didn't realize we had a representative strictly for Springwater, but she said she was going to be coming to the township in January to do a presentation, that she would be coming in front of council to do a presentation then. So I'm asking, would it be possible during this budget cycle to ask her to come sooner so that we could maybe alleviate some fears, but also understand better what next year looks like? Because I found it interesting they were waiting until January. So if that's possible, I would appreciate that.
Thank you. And I do see CEO Schmoot taking note of that. Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Councillor Moore. We can request that our account executive or account rep from MPAC visit. With respect to reassessment, it's MPAC is the organization responsible for providing property values, but they're not the organization responsible for setting the reassessment date. That is the Ministry of Finance. I would like to say if MPAC visits us, hopefully they will be able to provide a date, but in all likelihood, whenever that reassessment date is established, we will all find out at the same time.
Councillor Fisher?
I just a comment, and I appreciate Councillor Thompson reaching out to MPAC. I don't believe that it can just be when you have improvements done to your house. That would be the only trigger for taxes going up, and maybe that's what she said. I just find it very hard to believe. I mean, by that rationale, if we never improve our homes, our taxes never increase. So I'd like to have some clarity on that. And I'm not disputing what she said to you. I'm just saying, I just find that a little hard to believe that improvements would be the only way, or a permit being pulled would be the only thing that would trigger our reassessment. I'm under the impression it's sort of a mass reassessment, but I'd be curious to have a little bit more clarity on that.
Thank you. And I think we're just looking for the mass reassessment that happens every 4 years, as opposed to the individual reassessment that would happen to be triggered by a permit. However, if someone doesn't pull a permit and has done something to their home to increase the assessment, it would be part of the entire reassessment that they would experience a trigger. Assessment versus taxes. Director Bedard.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through the council that to Councillor Thompson's point, someone that didn't pull a permit and became assessed would likely see that significant tax increase because of that fairly significant change in market value, going from a 2016 valuation to a new valuation date, which could be 2024, 2025, at least around a decade change. To Councillor Fisher's point with respect to mass reassessment, as the video indicated, not all properties will change in value equally. If every property value went up by 5% in the township, no one would pay more. But if a property went up 10% and the township average was 5, they will pay slightly more because of reassessment. Similarly, if a property depreciated in value and only increased 2% when the township average was 5, they will see a decrease in property taxes payable. The goal of reassessment is to establish the tax burden on the property owner to which it belongs. So it's assigning the correct valuation based on the current market value to each property. So, again, to Councillor Fisher's point, if a property increases in value greater than the township average for that class, they will see an increase in taxes payable. But to Councillor Thompson's point, it will not be as significant with respect to someone that may have improved their property without a permit.
Follow on?
So just to make it clear, pulling a permit is not the only trigger for having your taxes increase.
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Fisher. I would agree. There's several factors. Building without a permit, reassessment, but again, the other factor that impacts taxes payable significantly is the budget increase.
And then when the mass reassessment, we'll call it, does occur, the increase to the homeowner on their assessment, is that experienced in the first year, or is that consecutively spread out over 4 years to get them to that next level of assessment, so that our residents aren't expecting a massive hit in the first year? It's 25%. Doesn't it increment 25% over the 4 years? Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Council. These next reassessment, hard to predict what will happen, but if we look at the last reassessment, any property that increased in value, that increase in value was phased in at a rate of 25% over 4 years as to help mitigate the taxes payable because of the change in assessment. On the contrary to any property that decreased in value, that decrease took effect 100% in the first year.
Sorry, Deputy Cabral?
Thank you. Appreciate that. Just a question on the home valuation that we're using here in Springwater. How accurate would that be? Is it something that we're getting from MPAC based on old data, or is it something that our own staff have come up with based on an average? Or I just want to know how accurate that number actually is. Because I would suspect too that when a house is sold and bought, that also MPAC would probably take that data into consideration too. I don't know if they do, but I would think that they would, because that's what the houses are selling for. So
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Deputy Cabral. The last point I'll address first with respect to sales price. The sales price will impact the reassessment. The sales price is a pretty good indication of what that market value is, so that will play a role in determining the next value on reassessment. With respect to the average taxpayer having a home assessed at $497,000, that is information generated from MPAC. So that is the average property valuation within the township. Just to build on that, I had our manager of revenue do a bit of research with respect to what properties are on the market for today, and comparing that to their assessed value. So within the Midhurst area, there's a property for sale in the $1.6 million range. It has an assessed value of $448,000. There is another property in the Midhurst area that has it's listed for $1.2 million. It has an assessed value of $470,000. Within the Elmville area, there are 2 properties for sale around the $1.3 million range, and they have an assessed value of $400,000. So when we look at that market value and compare that to assessed value, we see there is that disparity, and that growing disparity exists because reassessment has been postponed for so long. But I just, to just to provide additional content or not content, confidence in that 497 assessed value. I think we can see that through a simple MLS search, comparing that to the assessed value, that the assessed value is, is correct.
Follow on?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. And I do appreciate that because that's a number that, a lot of people are saying, I don't know what they're talking about, but it's all relative because it's based on data and our own taxation that is from 2016. So I appreciate that. It's not what the value is today, it's what the taxation value is on assessment today. Thank you.
Not seeing anything further on this. Council, no. We can move on to the next, please.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. The next section we will discuss or recap our 2025 proposed base budget. Next slide, please. The information before council on this slide is intended to show the total expenditures and total revenues for the township as a whole. While all property owners in the township will not be impacted the same, as some will be impacted by the additional costs of being provided with township water and or wastewater services. The nature of this slide is to highlight for council that the township is quickly approaching a $100 million annual consolidated budget. And it's just to provide that context of, as a township, this is our annual spend. And it is, to be honest, when I did my research, I did not expect it to be $100 million coming into my role. So just some context for council to consider. Next slide, please. With respect to the 2025 net tax levy increase, this slide is intended to provide additional context with how we arrived at the $2.8 million base budget increase. At this point, I believe CEO Schmidt has prepared some remarks to speak to this slide.
CEO Schmidt.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and good afternoon, Mayor Coughlin, members of council. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak. So I thought before we proceed into discussing the direction that council provided at the November 6th meeting, I wanted to take a few minutes to provide a bit of background or context as to what was presented on November 6th and as it pertains to the township's 2025-2026 budget and business plan. So I'm very aware of the chatter, I'll call it, that's across our social media channels right now, as well as some of the comments that have been made around this table, as well as in the public. And so I wanted to have the opportunity to provide a little bit of clarity here. So first off, I want to say by no means did senior management want to bring forward a budget that included a tax increase at the level that you saw on November 6th. That being said, I respectfully submit that senior management is responsible for providing our best professional advice to council, and it's council that has the ultimate responsibility to make the final decision and provide direction. What was presented to members of council on November 6th is a direct result of decisions and directions that have been previously made around this table. And by no means am I trying to point fingers or deflect responsibility. Staff are here to work with council and to provide our residents with value for money. However, staff were required to bring forward a budget, which they have been directed to do so. So let me explain further as we get into this slide. So on this slide, you can see that the township's net expenditures exceed our net revenues in the amount of approximately $2.8 million. And this slide's broken down into the key areas of where those pressures are coming from. So the first item is labor costs. So of the $2.8 million shortfall, we have labor costs of just over $1 million. And let me dive into what that really relates to. So of that, we've included a provision for a cost of living adjustment. And that's based on the salary min policy that council approved earlier this year. And I'm not at liberty here today to discuss what that percentage or number is. I think, and I'm not trying to shy away from it, I would suggest that council, if you wish, we could have a closed session meeting to discuss what the cost of living provision is in the budget. And I think it's important that we do that. Again, do not want to prejudice any negotiations that are currently in place with our bargaining unit as well as with the library. So happy to discuss that with you. There are dollars put in the budget for that, and we're happy to discuss that, just maybe in a closed session environment. Second to that, there's a provision included in the labor costs for merit or step increases. Again, this is for staff that are continuing to proceed along the pay grid, which again, we've had that discussion with council as to how the pay grid's kind of set up. Next, we have also included annualized costs for some of the new positions that were approved in the 2024 budget, as well as you may recall that there was 2 positions that were approved in year. And so our senior planner position as well as our licensing officer position, those were approved in year. And those 2 positions now we're having to pick up those full annualized costs in 2025. We didn't budget anything for those positions in 2024. So we have the full pickup of those 2 positions. In addition to that, we have group benefits that did come forward to council and was approved by council. It was a slight increase over 2024 levels. In addition to that, we have statutory deductions. So with CPP, our Canada Pension Plan, and employment insurance, OMERS, EHT, those are all percentage based. And as labor costs increase, those are all percentage based. So those also would increase. And those are payments that we do need to make and we're obligated to make to the province or to the feds, sorry. And then lastly, the impact of the healthcare spending account for townships volunteer firefighters has also been included in that just over $1 million labor cost. Secondly, the major pressure that's listed on the slide here is our general operating expenses, which equates to just over $310,000. So that again makes up 310 of the 2.8 shortfall. So this category includes general operating expenses that are required to continue to provide the same level of service to our residents that were provided in 2024. Includes items like utilities, fuel and vehicle expenses, contracted services, materials and supplies, and so on and so forth. Basically our general operating expenditures. So this equates to, on a budget of gross operating expenditure of about $29 million, this equates to about just over 1% of the increase. So rate of inflation around 2%. So 1% to continue to provide for those general operating expenditures. I think we're in line with what inflation is saying at least. Number 3 is the 1% capital infrastructure levy, which we previously talked about here earlier today. So this equates to $190,000 of the $2.8 million shortfall. And again, some members of council may recall that in previous years' budgets, council did agree to compound this figure. And so this is the impact of that compounding. We did have a discussion 2 or 3 years ago, and we showed you what the compounding impact was and what we weren't doing, and hence there was a deficit that was growing. And so at that time, council did approve that compounding. And again, I note that the township does have, we came to you back in October, I believe it was, with our asset management plan. We have an asset portfolio that equates to over $1.07 billion that we're required to maintain and care for. And so hence the additional 190. Doesn't seem like much, but it does add up over time. Fourth is the investment in capital funded from taxation. So maybe said a different way, this is the amount of money that's funded from our operating budget to support our capital budget. So in our capital budget, we have a number of different funding sources, development charges, reserves, reserve funds, debt. And if we don't have any other money, then essentially it comes out of the taxation or the operating budget. So of the $2.8 million shortfall, we have about $1.3 million that's in our operating budget to fund capital. And again, I'm not trying to be pointed with council, but understand there was direction provided by council earlier this year to increase our annual investment in road resurfacing projects to $3.5 million. And as a result of that, our annual capital and operating budget for this area has increased by just over $1 million. And that's what you're kind of seeing here. In addition to that, we have our facility assessment study that was recently undertaken, and it recommends significant investment in our corporate and community facilities. And this is also putting an additional pressure of approximately $200,000 on this year's budget. Our next item here is our service partners. So of the $2.8 million shortfall, our service partners are at about $650,000 of that, or account for $650,000 of that pressure. And again, council had the opportunity on Monday to have those discussions with those partners and inquire further about their budget requests. And all of those requests were further referred to the November 27th meeting, which we're happy to continue to have discussions with council about. And then just lastly, the estimated assessment growth. This is additional revenue that we're projecting based on our return assessment rule. It equates to an amount of $713,000, and that is assisting in bringing down the overall shortfall to $2.8 million. So again, staff has brought forward a budget that not only represents the needs of the municipality, but also as we were directed by council. You know, you're starting to see the culmination of individual decisions that are being made really come to head here. And so staff is ready and willing to work with council. We want to make sure that we bring forward something on December 4th that you can support. And so again, we look forward to our ongoing discussions with you and trying to get to a budget that you can be comfortable with. So at this point, Mayor Colgan, with your indulgence, I'll pass things back to Director Bedard unless there's any questions directed to me.
Deputy Cabral?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to CO Schmidt. CO Schmidt, I know we approved the fees and charges for facility use other than recreational back in the springtime there. And there was an expectation that there would be some surplus funds available for staffing. And I'm just wondering, that would have only covered 2024, and whatever we anticipated we would be getting is now rolled into general revenues, for lack of a better term, and any position that was put in place for that now is a position that being paid going forward, being taxation based for pay. Is that correct?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, through you to Deputy Cabral. Those positions that we brought forward, the senior planner to be funded through increased planning application fees. So in the 2025 budget, we have both. So we'd have the increased cost of the position, but then we also have the increased revenue projections as a result of the fees and charges that council approved. So we would be seeing both. We'd see the increased labor costs, which we've shown, and then the increased revenue would be part of the general operation, all that's been factored in. With respect to the other fees and charges that were updated, those would form part of our general revenues moving forward, and those would be used to offset any potential tax increase.
Follow on?
So just to wrap my head around that, for 2024, the funds were available through those new fees and charges. But going into 2025, those fees and charges are now basically rolled into the general budget, and any new hire or any existing one in 2024, that basically, in a nutshell, the money to pay anybody from those surplus funds from the fees and charges, because they did go up, going into 2025, that's no longer applicable to that individual. That's my question here. Or is it? Or does it just get rolled into the general operating budget?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, through you to Deputy Cabral. It would get rolled into the general budget, but they would be used to offset. So the argument presented in 2024 that increased planning fees would help offset the cost of the senior planner, that will hold true in 2025 as a result of the fee increase and expected activity that we anticipate. So while, on an individual budget line, it isn't net zero, it's a combination of our general revenues and general expenses, and that offset still exists, but it's just not in that individual spot.
Thank you.
Councilor Moore?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Just to be very transparent and very clear, does the township presently sit in a deficit position or a surplus position?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, through you to Councilor Moore. If we're looking at 2023, 2024, those fiscal years haven't been closed yet. What I would suggest is that if the township was looking at a significant deficit, we would have brought that information forward to you. Also, we would have been taking budget mitigation efforts internally to combat that. With respect to what that surplus amount is for each of these years, we haven't calculated that. I would be premature of me for me to share that information with you right now with respect to prior years. But again, if we were expecting a deficit or a significant deficit, it's my anticipation that that information would have flown through to council.
Councilor Alexander?
I just have a general comment, and understanding that absolutely, the decisions at this table and previous tables lead to the situation we're in right now. I don't think anyone would disagree that it's important that we went through the pay grid exercise, the benefits for our volunteer firefighters. There's many decisions we've made that have upped this number. And I think those were good decisions because we need to value an employer, pay our employees the right amount. What I'm struggling with kind of that concept or idea of it not necessarily being our fault, but the decisions do lay with us, is that knowing that labor is probably one of the biggest drivers. We knew, I'm assuming we knew before we did the budget that we were going to be coming into such a big increase, because you can usually kind of see that coming down the road. Why we consistently then would see the number of program changes and new hires on the upcoming budgets when we know we're in a position that is not favorable. So general statement.
Anything further for CEO Schmidt before we turn back to Director Bedard? Let's see.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. If we can move to the next slide, please. This is just a summary of the impact on the average residential property. In 2025, the average single-family detached residential property, again with that assessed value of $497,000, will see an increase in taxes payable of $361.63 over 2024. This impact takes into consideration township's base budget change that we just shared, the county's recent budget reduction that dropped from an estimated 4% to 3.625%, and no change to the education tax rate. So in summary, the average residential property will see a blended increase of $361 in 2025 or $30.14 per month. Next slide, please. Next up, this slide is to provide information relating to the impact on the average residential property with respect to water and wastewater. Again, only those properties that are provided with water and or wastewater services will be impacted by this budget increase. The impact on this slide is in addition to the previous slide with respect to properties that have water and wastewater services. So if you were provided with water and wastewater services, this is in addition to any property tax impact that that property will face. Based on an average annual water consumption of 180 cubic meters, the average residential property will pay $128 more in 2025. The impact of this increase is driven by the 4% water rate increase and 10% wastewater rate increase that were previously approved by council as part of the water and wastewater rate study. Next slide, please. Lastly, and before moving on to the next section of our agenda, this chart has been prepared to show the historical tax rate increase compared to the annual change in the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, as calculated by Statistics Canada. I understand there is a lot going on this chart, so if I could ask council to focus on the purple line representing the blended tax rate increase, and the red line, which represents annual CPI. From 2017 to 2020, the blended tax rate and CPI were much closer. However, CPI always outpaced the blended tax rate increase. More recently, and over the last few years, we can see the gap between the blended tax rate increase and CPI has grown, and it's expected CPI will continue to outpace the blended tax rate increase. With that, this concludes my notes on this part of the agenda.
Councillor Fisher?
Just because I've through you to Mr. Bedard, just because I've received a few phone calls about this, so maybe just to have it said in council chambers, for those of us or those people who have, say, septic and well, they wouldn't be affected by the increase in water and wastewater, or somebody with a septic system but on town water would be affected minimally. Like, these would be taken into account on their taxation. Can you speak to that just so people can hear it?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Fisher, if a property owner is connected to water and or wastewater services, it will never impact their property tax bill, but it will impact their utility bill. So for example, if a property owner has a water connection but a private septic, then they will see that increase in the water rate. Similarly, if someone has a well but is connected to the sanitary system, they will see the increase of the sanitary system rate increase only. So again, any rate increase with respect to township utilities would only be provided to those property owners who benefit from those services.
Not seeing any. Oh, Deputy Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I think for myself, I'm going to make a comment and then ask a question of Director Bedard. It's difficult to go through the budget and, see certain items that are lumped together because it really doesn't give me a true picture of where township is actually spending some of the dollars. We have a lot more contracted services now than we did 5 years ago. We used to do our own ditching. Now I see contractors doing the ditching. We used to do our own road sweeping. Now we have contractors doing it. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. There might be some cost savings involved there. But I would like to know just how hard would it be to provide members of council with a bit of a spreadsheet that would actually break down where we're spending our money, because I have no idea what we pay for our photocopier or how much paper we spend over the course of a year, how much fuel we actually buy, although, I mean, it's shown their fuel, but in that respect, it's difficult for me to say, hey, we might be able to save a few dollars here, a few dollars there. That information, and I don't think it's by design, is just not available to members of council, yet we're responsible for the budget. So I'm just curious whether or not there's an opportunity to break it down a little bit more in depth so that members of council can actually see where some of the dollars are going. How much are we paying for contracted cleaning services? All kinds of little things. How much money does township spend on mileage for staff, and is the mileage being appropriated for staff members? And I'm not saying anything about that. I'm just saying that we do have vehicles that are available, and is there an opportunity to utilize the equipment that we actually have in order to minimize the extra dollars that we might be spending? So my question is it possible to provide council with a more fulsome, lack of a better term, spreadsheet that would show us where some of these cost centers and break it down a little bit further so we can have a better look at what's going on?
Dr. Bedard.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Deputy Cabral, a lot of what you mentioned, with respect to that information, that's something that from a staff perspective, we go through line by line, we evaluate, that information with respect to should we increase the budget, decrease, our contracted services to better use of our time, or should staff be performing that, with respect to being provided with more information. If it's the will of council, that information, could be provided. Granted, I would suggest on November 20th to provide all that information to you and have that meaningful conversation. We probably may not be able to proceed with adopting the budget on December 4th. But that said, if the information is the will of council, then that would be something we would look to provide in a meaningful format.
Deputy Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. And I can certainly understand the position. I mean, we always seem to be under the gun. I know that in previous councils, there were members of council that did specifically ask for a line-by-line budget so that they could actually look at where the money was going. I mean, I don't know whether or not we have to know every little nuance, but it certainly would be interesting to look at what our budget is with respect to the cost centers and how those are broken down. So I, for one, would appreciate it if something might be able to be prepared and made available to us in a spreadsheet form. It would certainly give me a far better understanding of the pressures that staff have, and certainly the pressures that staff have tried to mitigate in preparing this budget. Because right now, it's a little bit difficult to do that because I can't see far enough down to really grasp where the money's always going.
Counselor Fisher?
Just, I concur. As a matter of fact, earlier on today, I was talking with CIO Schmidt about this, and a very informative conversation. Thank you. I think, you know, when I take a look, I know not too many years ago, we bought an excavator for ditching, right? And then we're contracting out ditching services. You know, in our last meeting, you know, I heard that we may not be hanging banners. We'll be farming that out to somebody else, right, in Elmvale. And I just, to say this, and I expressed this to CIO Schmidt, I'm not opposed to actually contracting out services. Often in the private sector, it makes more sense to do that. But what I would like to know is, does it make more sense to do it in some instances than to have staff doing it? And what cost savings would it be on our end? For example, why do we own an excavator? And if we're contracting out services, right? So at some point, and maybe within this budget or over the next year, I'd really like to drill down into that and know exactly, are we being redundant? I don't know if it's yes or not, yes or no, but is that an example of where we have equipment that we're not using because we're contracting it out? Do we have extra staff, or are we about to hire on extra staff that we're maybe in the future going to be contracting out services to do so? Again, I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I would like some more clarity on what the costs are and also what the savings are, if any, you know, and there could be. So just my 2 cents worth on that.
And I did see CIO Schmidt.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. So through you two members of council. So, you know, staff are taking your comments under direction here. That being said, I think it goes back to my original comment, and maybe I need to be a little more clear, I guess. There's also a level of trust, and we're here to work with you. We're here as partners to deliver on services in our budget for our residents. So there is a level of trust that has to go into this. And so I go back to the slide that I presented on slide 11. If you're looking to make some reductions or changes in the budget, I would heavily suggest that we look at capital, because that is the area where you're going to see the most area where we might be able to make a reduction, understanding the potential implications on that though, because we have infrastructure, $1.07 billion in infrastructure that we need to make sure we take care of. You know, labor costs, we can talk about the COLA in a different session, but really operating costs, as I said to you, it's $310,000 is what we're looking at. Yes, I understand every little bit counts, but that counts to like 1% on our $30 million operating budget. We need that money in order to continue to provide the services we're providing today. The 1% infrastructure levy, that's a conversation that council could have. If you don't wish to do that, hey, that's your call. The investment in capital funded from taxation of $1.3 million, if you want to make some decisions as to getting to a level that you're more comfortable with, that's where you're going to make some headway. So I, again, respectfully submit that to you. Not trying to be pointed to you. I'm just saying that that's where you're going to see some benefit if you wish.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And on the line by items, I would agree with Deputy Cabral. There are times where it's an encompassing label. And when you take the opportunity, when I took the opportunity to meet with each of our individual departments, and I do apologize. There was one that I ran over late for, but it was informative. You'd sit down and you would get a real understanding of the line by line, and you'd be able to pull it up and be like, okay, this is exactly what went into that. So I found that the information sessions that we had, I'd like to thank our senior management team for making themselves available to us. I found that to be very beneficial, and that information was available at that time. I have Councillor Garwood and Alexander.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and just more of a comment on the various discussions around the table around line by line items. You know, respectfully, I I see that as staff's responsibility. I do not see that to a certain extent, understanding we have many lines of data and information in a budget binder here that we've had the opportunity to spend time going through. I could receive an Excel document indicating the cost of fuel for various machinery, and I'm going to be honest with you, I do not know if that's an appropriate cost or not, because that is not my expertise. That's why we have staff. So echoing or adding on to what CEO Schmidt has noted, there is a level of trust. And again, we've said this many times. Feel like I'm echoing myself here when I say this consistently, but that's why we have staff in these professional positions that have the expertise to provide us advice. I don't believe that it is our responsibility to get into the day-to-day operations of this municipality. We have staff that has brought a budget. While it is challenging and while it is significant, that is why we have high-level opportunity today to go through and follow through with the direction that this council has provided previously around various different potential decreases. So that's where I see us benefiting, following through, understanding that a probably multiple 100-page Excel document is not going to, in my opinion, benefit us.
Councillor Alexander, Thompson, and Fisher.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. So I have a question to your point, CEO Schmidt, regarding the capital expenditure, and that's kind of the place which I assumed would be where we can kind of hone in if we're looking to bring down the 14.16 or 66, the incredibly high number. What I'm struggling with is this isn't new capital. Like this, we've had this capital for numerous years. So when I looked back for the past 2 years from my term on council, 2023, the increase that came to us, like at the beginning of the budget process, was 3.13%. Last year, it was negative 1.43%. How has it jumped to 14.16%? I get there's a labor component in there, but how has the capital jumped that much when that capital, the majority of it has always been there?
CEO Schmidt.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I'll start, and Director Bedard, I may need your assistance, but again, through you, Mayor Coughlin, to Councillor Alexander. So Councillor Alexander, as you may recall, back in March, I believe, of this year, there was a roads needs study that was provided to members of council, which essentially at that meeting, there was direction to invest at a $3.5 million level for a road rehabilitation project. So that doesn't include new roads as well, or urbanized roads and or growth related roads. So $3.5 million, I believe in that report, it mentioned that that would move our capital spend by about $1 million, but then would also bring on tack on essentially another $200,000 or $300,000 in operating costs. So that's where you're seeing that $1.3 million on that slide. About $1 million of that is related to that increase in investment for our roads projects, as well as there's the other component with regards to our facility condition assessment that brings another element of pressure, if you will, on the budget for 2025. I don't know if you have anything further.
And just further to that, the three, sorry, can you repeat the numbers that were from the last previous years?
2023 was 3.13, and this is just the operating. 2024 was negative 1.43.
CEO, can we confirm that those were the original proposed, or was that where council led, or where we fell to? Sorry, Councillor Alexander.
Sorry, I pulled them from the last two budget binders of the line item that matched the 14.16. Like, so what staff proposed, not where we landed, but what staff proposed as the operating.
Thank you. And I'm just looking for clarification on a decrease in operational costs.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I don't have that information right now, so I would happy to have that discussion with Councillor Alexander, just to ensure I understand exactly how the numbers were calculated from your end, and then we can verify whether we agree with that.
Thank you. And I do have a list here. So I have Councillors Thompson, Fisher, and Deputy Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. So I just want to thank staff, especially the directors, for having patience with me this last week on our one-on-ones. I found it very informative. I found them all very transparent. And I left with a confidence and an assurance that if there was efficiencies in the system, that they're scouring and looking for ways to save us money. About us getting more involved in procurement and looking for them for ways to save money. My experience and opinion over these last 2 years is any time that this council has got involved in procurement, it hasn't gone well for taxpayers. We ended up spending more and getting less for that. So my recommendation would not be to have us involved in deciding or telling staff what kind of paper to buy or things like that. I'm all for looking for efficiencies, and I'm confident that's already happening with the staff that we have.
Counselor Fisher and Deputy Cabral.
Well, I have to say respectfully, I disagree with Councillor Garwood's comments. And respectfully, we do trust staff, and actually, I like that CAO Schmidt was able to point us just moments ago in a direction of where to find cost savings if we were to be looking for them. But I believe our job as elected officials is to take a look at them in terms of a line by line item, because it is our duty to know about them, about where the money's being spent. And frankly, I go back to the example I just gave previously. If we're contracting out ditching, but we also own equipment, that's something in a line item that I should be drilling down into as an elected official, and we're in charge of people's money. So, and I also don't know where we got involved in procurement. So I'm a little curious about that. But I think it is our job to go, and I certainly don't expect any of us to know exactly what a backhoe costs or what cost of fuel is, but I think it is our job to drill down into them. And we are a board of directors. So respectfully, I do see that as our role. And I know it's been expressed to me from many constituents that that's what they want us doing in this budget. So.
Deputy Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. And I'm going to say this as respectfully as I can. I think the issue of trust is a two-way street. However, we're all built a little bit different. I'm an individual who likes to see and know what's going on. I'm sitting here at this table because residents thought that that's exactly what I would do. Budget is a council responsibility. It's up to this council to determine what the budget's going to be. So with all due respect, asking for a little bit more depth in where township spends its money, I really feel that I'm being placed in a position where it's almost as if I'm being admonished to the point where I shouldn't be asking any questions when it comes to money, because there's this issue of trust. Well, my nature, and for many other people, is when they do something, they want to be completely well informed. And that is my position. And I think by asking for a little bit more depth and a little bit more detail in where the money's going, and I'm certainly not suggesting when I mention paper that council is trying to dictate where the paper comes from or where they buy it, but I think it would be interesting to know out of our procurement policy, a lot of the items that are simply purchased online, whether or not we have opportunity to look at different vendors. I don't know how that works, but I would like to know how that works. And I will apologize to staff because I was not here for the week when the one-on-ones happened. Sometimes folks have to book things well in advance when they go away, and that's exactly what happened in my case. But I'm certainly not suggesting that I don't trust staff. I do, but that doesn't mean that I don't want to see what's going on. It simply means that I want to be well informed going forward. And if there's anybody on council who doesn't feel that way, that's their prerogative. But I'm starting to feel that some of the questions I ask is to implicate staff in some kind of a trust issue. And that is not the case at all. If I go to the store and I want to buy something, I want to know exactly what I'm buying. And I'm not representing just George Cabral here. I'm representing taxpayers in Springwater Township. And for me to do my job properly, sorry, but yeah, I do want to know what's going on. And I'm not going to apologize for asking those questions. Thank you.
Counselor Garwood.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Director Bedard, just going back to slide 11 of your presentation, it's on today's agenda here. The investment in capital funded from taxation is the $1.3 million of the roughly 2.8 million total consolidated net base budget. Can you just speak to the percentage of what that 1.3 million equates to in regards to the overall municipal portion of the 14% increase?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councilor Garwood, of the 14%, it's roughly 6%.
Councilor Garwood, following?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to either Director Bedard or CEO Schmidt. So just to clarify, that 1.3 million, for the most part, I believe CEO Schmidt noted roughly $1 million of that was directly from council direction earlier this year, correct?
CEO Schmidt?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councilor Garwood. That's correct.
Councilor Moore?
Thank you. Director Bedard, you had provided us with a slide that showed like the graph, but it was in number form, which for me was a little, easier to look at exact numbers. Just wondering, the policing portion is not there. And so if you could maybe speak to why it's not included in that. And also just a quick comment to say that thank you to staff for being available. But as you know, I do work full time, so I'm not available to come in during the day. But I do read, and I've been provided the budget binder, and I can read it front to back, which I have. So note that I am fully informed, even if I wasn't able to make an appointment with you. So if the slide then with the numbers, could we put that up? So this, but you had provided it to council before. Is it easy to get to or not?
Director Bedard?
It had a historical overview from, say, the last 10 years of where we had been with our tax increases.
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councilor Moore, we have that information. Are you asking for it to be, shared right now on the screen, or just
If possible, because I'm sure members of the public are likely watching. So I think it would be helpful.
I'll give you a minute to dig up that email.
Sorry.
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through to council, we in collaboration with the clerk, we could bring that information up on the slide. If you could just give us a moment.
Maybe while she's working on that, could you speak to the policing portion then, and why the policing portion you don't have included in that email, that historical look that she's going to put up, or what you've provided here is fine.
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through to Councilor Moore, it'd be appreciated if we could work with the clerk first to get that information. I can resend it over and then answer your question at that time.
No, it was an email that was sent to council. Didn't form part of the. CEO Schmidt?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councilor Moore. So Councilor Moore, I believe the information was on the screen. That's the historical tax rate increase. So it includes the policing in it. So it's all in. So the blended piece would be the county, Springwater, and police and OPP. The Springwater piece does include OPP. I know years ago we used to split it, but and our deputy treasurer may need to help me here, but I can't remember what year it was whereby I guess we were advised by MTE, a tax consultant, that we were no longer permitted to do that. So we have combined policing within our overall Springwater rate on a go-forward basis. But years ago, you're correct, we were splitting it out, even on the tax bill.
And I think we even had streetlights split out at one time too, so it's all been pulled back in. So are you requiring the slide still then? Sure.
If it's easy to find, if it's.
And maybe what we'll do then is maybe just take a quick little break if everybody wants about five minutes, and we'll recess for 5 minutes and come on back. All right, council, we will resume here and we have a table to put up on the screen. And I will turn back to Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. So I wanted to post this to, sorry, George. Thought you
Apologize, I had to use myself.
Oh, sorry, you're saying something. I just wanted to highlight the tax increases over the last, for 8 years. And how when we look at the CPI, they haven't been too inconsistent except for 2022. And I wanted to highlight also COVID, because COVID happened as well. And so you can see 2020, or 2021, sorry, everybody was consistently zero, not just Springwater, but that I feel overall we have been pretty consistent, not just in the last year or two sort of catching up, but that for the last 8 years, we've done a good job at keeping our taxes down.
Don't have a list going, so council, if there's anything further on the presentation. Another presentation. Okay, perfect. Yeah. Director Bedard.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. If the clerk could please pull up slide 18, that's where we will begin the next leg of our journey. Um, This next section of our agenda will focus on council direction from November 6th. Next slide, please. In summary, I'm not going to read the resolution. Council is aware of it. There's 2 deliverables that staff were tasked with performing. The first being various tax increase scenarios, and the second being prioritize list of program changes, and we will cover these items next. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. All right, so with respect to the tax increase scenarios portion of the resolution, staff used several criteria when evaluating the scenarios that are presented for council's consideration. When staff looked at the various scenarios to present, the first criteria we looked at was to maintain 2024 service levels, and this was first and foremost. To that extent, currently we're not presenting any changes to the operating budget that impact service levels. The next criteria staff used to evaluate the tax increase scenarios was council's resolution with respect to the roads rehabilitation capital plan spending target of $3.5 million. This represents council's endorsement of the roads need study, and the tax increase scenarios maintain the required $3.5 million investment that the council resolution requires. Lastly, and this isn't, the full list of criteria we use, but just the main 3, we look to reduce or defer 2025 capital projects that were funded through taxation. And this speaks to CAO Schmidt's previous comment with respect to looking to bring down the tax increase, and this is primarily achievable through a reduction in the capital plan that is funded through taxation. When staff look to defer or reduce 2025 capital projects, this included an internal prioritization of projects funded through taxation, and further, if there was the opportunity to reduce or defer such projects to a future year, whoever doing so would further build on the township's current infrastructure deficit. Next slide, please. Scenario 1. This first scenario represents a $328 annual increase for the average taxpayer. This is a $33 reduction from the proposed $361 annual increase that was detailed earlier. This tax increase scenario contemplates 2 budgetary changes. The first change is to adjust the budget to expected Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund or OMPF revenues. During budget preparations, several estimates are required until such time as funding is confirmed. This is one of those estimates. The draft budget included an anticipated decrease to OMPF revenues to match our historical trend. Very recently, the township received notice of our 2025 OMPF allocation, and we will be receiving more in 2025 than we received in 2024. This positive news impacts the township's budget by $115,000. This funding source is used to offset operating expenses. The second change is removing the 1% compounding effect of the infrastructure levy. That said, the infrastructure levy under this scenario will remain in the 2025 budget at the existing 2024 level. However, the compounding effect no longer applies, and approximately $190,000 has been removed from the budget. These proposed changes do not impact service levels in 2025. The reduction of the compounding effect of the infrastructure levy, however, will limit the township's financial ability to meet its future infrastructure replacement needs. Next slide, please. The second tax increase scenario represents a $46 decrease from scenario 1. In total, this scenario represents a $282 increase for the average taxpayer. This scenario includes the two items contemplated in scenario 1, as well as a reallocation of funding within the capital budget. This scenario proposes that approximately $418,000 worth of roads capital work be funded from debt instead of taxation. This scenario maintains council's resolution requiring a $3.5 million annual investment in roads rehabilitation without reducing or deferring the scope of any roads projects or impacting current service levels. Next slide, please. The third tax increase scenario represents a $48 decrease from scenario 2 and also represents a $234 annual increase to the average taxpayer. This scenario includes three items contemplated in scenario 1 and 2, plus a further reduction of funding in the capital budget, as well as a reduction in the scope of the facilities capital program. In more detail, this scenario proposes that approximately $208,000 worth of roads capital work be funded from debt instead of taxation. Again, this scenario maintains council's resolution requiring a $3.5 million annual investment in roads rehabilitation without deferring or reducing the scope of any roads projects or impacting current service levels. This scenario also proposes a reduction in the scope in the facility condition assessment program in the amount of $210,000. The reduction in the scope of this project represents capital spending that will need to be deferred to 2026 or further years. This scenario may also negatively impact the township's existing infrastructure backlog. In conclusion, when presenting these scenarios for council's consideration, staff look to maintain service levels at 2024 levels, maintain council's resolution requiring a $3.5 million annual investment in roads rehabilitation, and limit reducing scope and deferral of projects. These scenarios have been presented with this criteria in mind.
Thank you, Director Bedard. And before I do turn to members of council, I want to remind council that we do have a hard stop at 4:30 today. So I just didn't want to catch anybody off guard in 40 minutes when we call the meeting. So I will open it up for comments and questions. I have Deputy Cabral, Councillor Garwood.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. And I guess through you to CAO Schmidt. CAO Schmidt, since we're removing taxation funding from capitals, I'm just wondering if it's a reasonable scenario to take the $210,000 out of that infrastructure reserve that we put in a substantial amount of money last year into there that might satisfy providing some relief and also not impact our capital going forward.
Director Bedard.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Deputy Cabral. We could look at drawing further from that infrastructure reserve that we have. In my opinion, we wouldn't recommend that from a staff perspective. And when we look at our roads and our facility condition assessment program, these are annual programs that the township wishes to endeavor to improve our assets. When we start funding these from reserves, we're really pushing that tax increase into the future year. So it could be something we could consider in 2025 to fund that from reserves, but we would bring that back in 2026 to be funded from taxation. And the reason we want to fund that from taxation is because taxation is the only guaranteed source of revenue the township has. So if we want to do something on an annual basis and we want it to be sustainable, we need to fund that from taxation. So this is why we recommended reducing the scope rather than drawing from reserves. But again, that would be for council's consideration.
Follow on?
Thank you very much, Director Bedard. I guess my thought process on that is we have been putting that additional fund into the infrastructure and, managed to put some more into there. I know it's catch-22 though, so I do appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Councillor Garwood?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. My question is going to be focused on the facilities condition assessment program. So either to Manager Dean or Director Culver. Thank you. A potential reduction of $210,000 in this program. Can you speak to the impact on what that'll have to planned work in those facilities? Understanding that from what I understand, fund directly is related towards our community spaces, community halls, arena, etc.
Director Culver?
I'll bide some time until Manager Dean gets here. There are a couple of key items that were identified in the facility condition assessment that we felt could be deferred for at least a year. Some of them are related to projects that definitely would benefit from improvement now, but also have some other considerations in play that we would want to evaluate. So I think it's not the worst decision or the hardest decision to make, but I'll defer to Manager Dean for more information.
Manager Dean?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through yourself to Councillor Garwood and the rest of council. I think Director Culver summed it up pretty well, that we, within the facility condition assessments, by no means do we hit every single thing that is mentioned within kind of the short-term 1 to 5 year or 1 to 10 year items within each facility. So staff do assess it kind of from, call it a green light through red light approach, looking at kind of the most emergent needs. So structural needs, anything that would cause larger damage or potentially cause larger issues into the future, and then kind of more those aesthetic values or something for improvements. Again, there is energy efficiency improvements that would be mentioned in there, but might not be on an item that would be at its true end of life scenario for that year. So they are assessed that way. So staff went back through that list and kind of kept in the most needed items, and then removed a large project or two. I don't want to say removed, deferred a large project or two.
Follow on, Councillor Garwood?
Thank you. And thank you both for that answer. And the reason I ask, of course, and first of all, thank you for trying to find those efficiencies, understanding that these are challenging conversations and decisions that have to be made. Assuming that there's potentially a certain level of unexpected costs as well that will come up throughout the year, that fund would be utilized for. But also on the flip side, I can use a recent example. I believe the replacement of the doors at the Anvil Arena was an example of a use of that fund in the past. The reason I highlight this specifically is, of course, I don't think it's abnormal for all 7 of us up here to receive concerns and questions about our community spaces. We recently just toured an amazing new space in Grenfell, but I also know every community wants a space like that. So as we remove dollars from this program, which I struggle to do and struggle to get behind, I want the community to understand that when we make these decisions, it limits our ability to continue to make those investments in the future. So anyway, thank you both for the answer.
Counselor Alexander?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and further to Counselor Garwood's comments, and I probably directed to Manager Dean. When I look at, when I review the budgets and I review the capital projects, oftentimes you see carry forward. So we approved it last year. Sometimes we approved it a couple years ago. And I think it's simply staff time, like numerous different reasons that we cannot do it that year. So it just simply gets carried over. Did we look at projects in that light as well as again, nice to have, but we're probably not going to have time to do it this year regardless.
Manager Dean? Director Culver?
Yeah, if I could, Mayor Coughlin, and thanks, and it's an excellent question, and definitely we did review the project list to see what was, I know council's probably tired of me using the word capacity all the time, but truly within staff capacity, we had to make sure that what we put on the schedule can be accomplished, and that's the very first line of trimming, as it were, or deferral that we take on before we budget, before we set up the budget draft.
CEO Schmidt?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. And I would just further to Director Culver's comments, from a senior management perspective, when we're reviewing budget, and we've reviewed it a number of times, as we normally do, it's one of the first questions we always ask is, do we actually have the capacity internally to actually deliver on these projects? And so it is definitely a conversation around that table, and it's something that we don't take lightly. So.
Follow on?
Thank you. I appreciate the answers, and I'm going to dive a bit deeper because this is my professional career. So when we're looking at that, so when I'm looking at, again, I don't know off the top of my head, but there are a handful at least of projects that, have been deferred over a couple of years. And then, so I'm assuming those would get prioritized in first. And then next, we would be looking at the next ads for this year. I'm just hoping, I want to make sure we're looking at the full scope. So if we have, I'm just going to throw out 5 projects from last year or the year before, and then we're saying, okay, well, we want 5 new projects this year. Are we realistically getting 10 done, or do we only have capacity for 5? So we should be doing the previous ones.
Director Culver?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and another excellent question. I have to say that again, and I've been here since April, so allow me that I've had a brief period to kind of assess. But as of right now, and without a full cycle under my belt, I will say that right now we're in the position of constantly reprioritizing. Every month brings a new priority. It's unfortunately we're in a bit of a reactive space, which is it's unfortunate and costly, but at the same time necessary, given that again, things like Hunter Russell Trail Bridge goes into decline, and we spend about 2 months trying to assess, what is the right approach there, and be able to bring something into the budget. That takes a lot of time, and that forces something to go down the list in terms of that addressing the projects as they come. So I get your question in terms of, we have 5 things that are carrying over, and then we add 5 things, and are we going to get all 10 things done? The answer to that question is I don't know, because truthfully, we're constantly juggling priorities in order to try and do the best job we can to deliver the services that we're told are expected in the community. So again, I want to answer your question better than that, but I also need to answer it honestly.
And I did skip over Counselor Fisher and then Counselor Moore.
So just a quick question. When I go back to remove taxation funding for roads and capital, but fund from debt, if I guess through the chair to anyone on staff, really, could you bring me through what that would look like, how that would save us initially, what percentage we'd look to pay, and would that just be taking the money of today that we'd spend on taxation and pushing it into the future? Just essentially take us through what that scenario would look like.
Dr. Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Councillor Fisher, your analogy of the situation would be correct. We to bring the tax rate down in the current year and to maintain council's resolution for $3.5 million being spent on road rehabilitation, we would have to take on additional debt to meet that spending target if we can't fund it from taxation. So what we would be doing is taking on that debt in 2025, and we would start repaying that debt in 2026. So we would see that tax increase from the debt in the 2026 budget. So, your analogy is correct. We're reducing the tax rate this year, but we would be increasing it in the subsequent year to start paying down that debt.
Counselor Fisher?
And we wouldn't see the full, say, 3.5 million. See really our expenditure would just be on what we're servicing the debt with, essentially our payment, if you will. And also what percentage would we be paying? I guess what I'm saying is this viable, right? Is the note that we'd be paying on it going into the future, say, I'm going to say probably a 20-year note on it. Is it smart to take this, or is it not smart? Are we going to find ourselves in a position where we've essentially debt financed this, and within that 20 years, we're going to have to take on more debt because, as we all know, the roads deteriorate? Is it going to be debt and then 5 years more debt, and then is it going to compound? Is that a scenario that I see playing out, or you see playing out, or is it maybe a smart scenario where we're not spending the money right now and the debt is cheap and it's a smart scenario to do? Maybe if you could take us through maybe your opinion on that.
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Fisher. The interest rate we would be paying would depend on whether we go to market to, secure a formal loan through a financial institution or through Infrastructure Ontario, or if we were able to borrow internally from our existing reserves. If we were to go out to IO, and I wouldn't suggest we would debenture a road over 20 years, at most, we would probably be looking at 15 years maximum. The rate on a 15-year loan through IO right now is 4.28%. That said, that's the rate right now, anticipating it will likely decrease in the future. But, that's the information that we have right now. If council was to consider financing that internally through our reserves, which is, the money held in our bank, representing our reserve balance, we could set that rate anywhere from 0 to whatever you wished it to be. What I would suggest that rate to be would be what we would be getting on our savings account through our bank. That way, we are maintaining that level of investment income and our money isn't losing value. So if we were to borrow internally from ourselves, we would look at the interest rate the bank gives us on our savings and then use that to factor in our annual repayment.
Following?
So I'm just thinking here, thinking of scenarios. If we were to, do we have the capacity to debt finance ourselves, right? And do we see projects as they get paid off internally rather than going through a debenture? Could you see a scenario where we're refilling those reserves and we can continuously debt finance ourselves and keep that interest in-house? Is that a scenario that you or CAO Schmidt see playing out? Because if we can keep taxes lower now, but also keep the debt internally financed, we're essentially borrowing off ourselves. Do we have the capital to do it? And are we going to be paying ourselves back in time where when the next project comes up, we can also debt finance ourselves then? Are we going to hit debt capacity internally or not?
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Fisher, the scenario you've explained as what we're trying to accomplish internally is to incrementally increase the amount of internal borrowing that we have, so that when we pay off a project, we have that capacity internally to roll that available funding into the next project. And, we have that capacity right now because of the reserve balance that we currently maintain. And to your point, once we build this internal debt into the budget, it's in the budget until we decide to take it out. So it could continue in perpetuity, and we could continue to fund capital works internally to a certain extent, to the extent that our cash flow allows us to do that. This is something CAO Schmidt and I had discussed, and we have prior experience doing so. We can't get this internal capacity, it's not something we can ramp up significantly in the moment. It would be something that we would look to do over several years, incrementally increase that amount so that we are leveraging our capital internally without having the need to go externally.
Yes.
just to comment on it, if we have the know-how to do that internally and manage it, because it's not a one-time thing, that's a management over time. I mean, just my comment on it. If we're not going out in a debenture, if we're keeping it internally, keeping taxes low, but also managing this and paying ourselves back, I think this is a scenario we should look at. But I think it really hinges on having the expertise in-house, which I'm sure we do. Trust staff, right? But that seems like a likely scenario, a bit of a win-win on both sides. That's my 2 cents worth on it from the onset.
I think the second portion of the question was the external debt capacity at 77. What's the percentage for external? I think it was in the budget binder at 77%.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. In the budget binder, I believe it indicated that the township could borrow up to 77 million over a 20-year term at maybe a 5% interest rate. Granted, interest rates are slightly lower, but they would fluctuate based on the the term. That said, based on our current debt we have right now, we're utilizing less than 10% of our available capacity.
Thank you for that. I have, I don't know which list I was on. My apologies. I was back down to Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I just wanted to circle back to something Councillor Garwood had mentioned and in regards to the Grenfell Hall and potentially how it relates to the Facility Condition Assessment Fund. But I'll ask CAO Schmidt to speak to how that renovation was funded, because it wasn't funded by it was funded by the developers, the local developer. Do you remember? I can speak to it, CAO.
I think it was the road. There was a road allowance, or there was purchase of something that went specific to the
It went
area.
to Ward 4, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
CEO Schmidt.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Moore. So Councillor Moore, I believe, looking to my colleagues here, I believe that was funded through a contribution that the township received through, I believe it was maybe the Midders Valley subdivision, where the council of the day was aware of a contribution that was provided, and some of those funds were used to renovate the Grenfell Hall.
Councillor, sorry, did you have following? Yes, Councillor Fisher and then Councillor Garwood.
Sorry, not to belabor it. I guess it is sort of like going down this road with this internal debt financing. But it's intriguing to me because I think it has a lot of positives. But I think also, I think it's safe to say, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that our actual debt capacity, if we were to take on debt for future projects, Craig Road, the hub, right? Because that money is internal, that wouldn't affect that external borrowing capacity. Am I correct in saying that?
Director Bedard.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. And through to Councillor Fisher, after conferring with the CAO, we're on the same page that it would not affect that capacity.
And Councillor Garwood.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Just two items, and just back to the item specifically on the facility assessment. I was just using Grenfell as an example in regards to a renovation that the community is seeing coming forward. Again, back to Manager Dean's comments around upgrades to various different facilities. Again, the community sees it; they don't know necessarily where it's funded from. They just expect it, right? So my goal here is to be transparent and say to the community, while we might want a coat of paint here or new floors here or new this there, reducing that fund pushes those projects off. So that was just the example. Moving forward or backwards, depending upon how you look at it. Again, back to slide 11 from the presentation, and I'm focusing once again on the investment and capital funded from taxation, that 1.3 million. And I'll direct this to Director Bedard, and please, if I'm misunderstanding this or it's a silly question, then please just be blunt with me. But I guess my concern or my question is understanding that my question earlier on spoke to the percentage associated with that. So around that $1 million equates to 6% of the 14% increase. So can you break down specifically what that line is, understanding that that is part of the council direction from earlier on this year to invest into various different roads projects, et cetera? Would it not make more sense as a potential option to retract significantly from that? Yes, that's going against our own direction that we provided, while in turn keeping other items in, like the 1% infrastructure levy and the facility condition assessment program. So really just moving the money around a bit. So I also might be talking in circles here a bit, but if you could provide a bit of clarification, I'd appreciate it.
I'm going to try and translate on that. What I think I'm hearing is because council provided direction at 3.5 million, so staff had to continue with that 3.5. If council was to either revisit or provide altered direction whereby instead of 3.5 this year, we want to do 3 million. And what that would look like then to the other situation. So it would be a decision of council whether we wanted to remain at the 3.5 level or if we were to change our, I want to say initiative, or I think it's aggressive, but we need to be aggressive. We know that that gap is there, but if we're experiencing this increase, in order for those scenarios to be run, that would be required by either a revisiting of council. Is that correct?
Sorry,
Whoever's
Mayor.
side goes first.
Sorry, Mayor Coughlin. Can you pose your question again? Apologies.
Oh, I was just trying to add on to Councillor Garwood because in the scenarios that were presented, it was presented to us instead of funding it all out of taxation, that the 3.5 didn't change, the funding source changed. However, if council was to reduce the 3.5 to whatever number we find palatable, it could remain out of taxation, not out of debt, or continue with the debt, and it would again then decrease the overall tax implication. But that would require a new resolution, whether it's revisited or whichever, of council, correct?
Through you, Mayor Coughlin, my understanding is because council's provided previous direction as it relates to this item, that my understanding is it would need to be a reconsideration.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Garwood? Thank you for that. Deputy Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I guess on that one, I don't know how it works because normally when we spend money, there's no reconsideration. So I don't know how that one would work. But I do have a question through you, Mayor Coughlin, to Director Bedard. My understanding thus far has been that we are looking into the future for supplementary assessment very conservatively. And I need you to go back to that last slide. I guess it was the 8 something scenario. And I'm just looking at that 210, and I have to struggle with in-house debt financing and then kind of not having it affect our ability to borrow money outside. It's still a transfer of funds. But what I want to know here, if it's possible, is that $207,680. From what I understand, it's a fairly conservative as far as the supplementary assessment that we're anticipating we're going to be receiving. So I'm just wondering if it would not be possible to basically at some point in time utilize surplus assessment as the year moves forward in 2025, basically earmark a specific dollar value of potential supplementary assessment that comes online to satisfy that 207,680. And if we don't achieve that mark, then council will have to revisit it where it's going to come from. Is that something that we could do? Because that means we don't have to really finance it. We just have to wait it out a little bit and hopefully it'll materialize.
Director Bedard.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Deputy Cabral. Trying to process the request and how we would handle that. If we were to fund a project from additional supplementary revenue, we would have to budget for that revenue to come in. So we would increase our supplementary revenue budget. which would decrease the tax rate because we would be budgeting for more revenue. And if we didn't meet that budget target, we would have to expense that somewhere else or we would be short.
Follow on?
Thank you, Mayor Conlon. I guess on that particular note too, if we did debt finance internally, would we be in a position at some point through the year to revisit the supplementary assessment, and if there was sufficient funds in it at that time to direct it to satisfy that debt?
Yeah, I think so. When we receive our report on the annual surplus that's going to be coming forward and whenever that comes to us, it would be to the discretion of council whether we wanted to apply it to internal debt or if we wanted to put it back into our tax stabilization reserve. CEO Schmidt?
Through your Mayor Coggan, and just to help the conversation, that has been what we've done in the past. Maybe not in the last year or two, but definitely over the course of 10 years, give or take, we were doing some internal debt financing, and that's exactly what we were doing is we'd come to council with the supplementary. I would always maybe call it gravy to council, extra money, and we essentially gave council the opportunity to fund that internal debt, if you will, and or allocate it in other locations, if you will.
Councillor Alexander?
Thank you, Mayor Coggan. So just with all the different scenarios we're talking about, which I appreciate, thank you for coming back with them. I do have a question stepping back a bit. So we're looking at 14+% this year. But when we're looking at the two biggest drivers are the labor costs and then the capital, which, and again, from my understanding, the roads, it's ongoing. It's not like we're spending the money this year, then we're perfect. Where are we looking moving forward as a base operating budget? Are we looking to always be right as we sit right now in the 14% increase, maybe a bit less, because hopefully the OPP doesn't keep jacking it up. But is that this, like, whereabouts are we looking to be? And I know it's a year away, but we must have some sort of visibility given our current state where we're looking to be going long term with this, just so we have an understanding of moving money around and what that's actually going to accomplish.
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Through you to Councillor Alexander. I guess I'll start with how we built this budget. So there's two components. There's increased operating costs, and then when we built the budget, we're taking on debt for a number of projects. So when those projects are completed, the debt repayment will commence in the next year. So there are whether it's internal or external, that's still money that we have to fund that will increase the budget in the next year. How that impacts our overall picture, it depends on how successful we are with our capital work plan. The other component that will impact our budget moving forward is that $3.5 billion roads reconstruction target that we have. So of that $3.5 million, we're funding as it stands right now before we get into any of these tax increase scenarios or tax decrease scenarios rather. We're funding of that $3.5 million, $1.5 million is from grants. Approximately $1 million is from taxation and $1 million is from debt. So in my opinion, the debt component of that isn't sustainable. We need to slowly and incrementally increase our level of taxation support while decreasing the debt that we are required to have. So, if we reduce the taxation support for our roads resurfacing program this year, we're going to have to see that increase in future years. Maybe it was aggressive on behalf of the finance department to suggest we could do it over 2 years, which is, as we presented right now, $1 million increase this year, $1 million increase next year. That said, we could spread that over 5 years or a length of time at your discretion, where we would incrementally increase our taxation support, decrease the debt, and then that roads resurfacing program would be self-funded. In terms of 2026, what that tax increase will be it be 14%? At this point, I don't want to use, Director Culver mentioned it, my start date was May as well, a little after his. I think there's still a lot for myself to learn about the township. Could it be 14%? I would say anything's possible. Will it be 2% or 3%? I would bet against that.
Thank you for that. Counselor Fisher?
So through you to, I guess to anyone on staff, at what point would you say it would be sustainable internally if we're debt financing it? Right now, you said the $1 million is a bit aggressive, right? But at what point would it be sort of 2 budget cycles, 3 budget cycles? At what point do you think we'd reach a point where internally, you know, when a project is being paid for and another one's going on, what sort of timeline before you think it's I think you said like self-sustaining throughout it?
I'm tempted to say Chief Kirk. When you said anybody on staff, I was like, I'll just pick one. Director Bedard.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you too, Councillor Fisher. I would suggest that for a program like this to be successful, it would need the support of multiple terms of council, really. That, you know, it would be something that, you know, would require that long-term support. You know, for example, if we were internally financing a road over 10 or 15 years, we're not going to see that debt paid off for, you know, potentially 3 or 4 councils. So we would need to, you know, have that continual support for multiple terms. And also knowing that once we built it in 1 year, so, you know, say for example, we internally finance and it's just for 2025. In 2040, we'll have that room available. But if we continually and incrementally do it every year, we will free up debt capacity every year. And one of the things that we're also considering with our capital budget is also not all of our debt financing is over 15 years. You know, some of it we're projecting over 5 or 4 years or short term, so that it incrementally will free up that capacity. And we don't need to wait into the long term to, you know, see the benefits of internal borrowing.
Yeah, and being mindful of our time, council, we have about 10 minutes here. Deputy Cabral?
Thank you, Mayor Collin. Just a comment on the debt financing when we're doing it internally. I hate to say it, but I always think about the catastrophic issue that might come up that's going to drain our coffers. So I'd be a little bit hesitant to do it unless we absolutely had to. And I think too that the opportunity to pay it off as we have in the past for some of these particular ones to $207,000 anyway. I think that's probably the best route to go. I don't know how much headroom we have, but I'd hate to use it all up. It ties our hands going down the road too a bit.
Thank you for that. Anything further on this, council? So it would be looking for direction. Right now in front of us, we just have that the presentation be received. And that, oh no, sorry, we're still not done. CEO Schmidt. Director Bedard.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I have one last section, and my speaking notes on this last section are very short. So I think from my part, I will do my best to get us done by 4:30. Right, moving to the second part of council's resolution from November 6th, and this was with respect to prioritizing the program changes that staff had presented. So internally, program changes were evaluated in a similar manner to the tax increase scenarios that were just presented. In that a list of set criteria, and it's not exhaustive on the slide in front of you, were used to determine prioritization. This criteria included the potential impact on service delivery. The list of criteria also included if program change had any revenue generated capability. And lastly, if the impact of the program change, the impact the program change had on addressing current and future growth requirements. You know, with this criteria in mind, the township's proposed 2025 program changes have been prioritized for council's consideration over the next 2 slides. Next slide, please. So program changes were previously listed in the 2025 budget in alphabetical order by department. This slide and the next slide now list the prioritization of program changes as determined by the township's leadership team. The list of program changes encompass the collective needs in order of magnitude that staff feel the township required to move forward. The information relating to the prioritization of program changes is being presented at this time only for council's consideration. Sorry, it's being presented for council's consideration only. We're going to be talking about this next Monday as well. And you know, the point I'm trying to make here is that this information should be considered when you are evaluating on the merit of each individual program change found within the budget book. Please note that each program change will be elaborated on further by the respective department director during budget deliberations held next Monday. So again, this information is presented with respect to the prioritization only, and it's intended to allow for a more fulsome discussion to occur next week when council will have the chance to hear from each department director with respect to the merit of each program change.
Councillor Fisher?
So sorry, just when I look over and see 5.12%, that would be on top of, if we were to say yes to all of this, that would be on top of the 14.99%.
Director Bedard?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Councillor Fisher. Yes, that is correct. And this is the township only, so the number there isn't the blended impact. That's just the impact on the township's portion of the budget.
We look forward to those discussions next week. Now can I move on to the resolution? And I think too, it's important to note that should council wish to have our direction of 3.5 million, if we're looking to have that reconsidered by council, we could do that during any of these meetings to provide opportunity for staff to provide scenarios to us to look to move forward. So we're at the next one. All right. I have What if I don't say your name? CEO Schmidt.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I just want to also remind members of council maybe, or make them aware that the intent for Monday's session is not just program changes, but it's also for members of council, should you have any of your own proposed amendments, if you will, additions, deletions, amendments to the budget, operating capital. I believe the intent is that those were to be submitted. If you wanted to submit those in advance, they could form part of the agenda for Monday. If you do not, obviously you have the ability to make changes on Monday as well. But there was a mention to members of council to provide those to the clerk's office, I think, by this Friday.
May I have a mover and seconder to receive the presentation, please? I have Deputy Cabral and Councillor Alexander that the presentation regarding the 2025-26 draft and supported operating capital budget as amended from the Director of Finance be received, and that the 2025-26 draft tax supported operating and capital budget as amended be referred to the November 27th, 2024 budget session for further consideration. All those in favor? And that has carried. May I have a mover and seconder to refer the draft water and wastewater rate-based operating budget? Councillors Thompson and Fisher, that the 2025-26 draft water and wastewater rate-based operating budget be referred to the November 27th budget session for further consideration. All those in favor? And that has carried. And a mover and seconder for the prioritized list? Councillor Moore and Councillor Garwood, that the prioritized list of program changes be referred to the November 25th, 2024 budget session for further consideration. All those in favor? And our bylaws for confirmation, Deputy Cabral and Councillor Thompson, that bylaw 2024-093 to confirm and adopt the proceedings of council at the special meeting held on November 18th, 2024, listed here and be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. All those in favor? And our adjournment, please. Councillors Moore and Fisher, that the special meeting of the Township of Springwater does now adjourn at 4:28 p.m. to meet again in regular meeting on November 20th at 6:30 p.m. All those in favor? And that is carried. Thank you.